The night before the council's decision was the longest of Lucas's life. He sat in his quarters and stared at the wall and tried not to think about everything that could go wrong. His squadron had gathered in the common room, talking quietly and waiting for news that would not come until morning. No one was sleeping. Maya came to check on him around midnight. She asked how he was holding up. He told her he was fine, which they both knew was a lie. She sat down across from him and said nothing for a while. Sometimes silence was better than words. Eventually, she asked if he regretted what he had done. If he had known it would come to this, would he have made the same choice? Lucas thought about the question carefully. He thought about his career and his people and everything that was now at risk. He thought about the comfortable retirement he had been planning and the quiet life he had wanted. He thought about all the reasons he should have looked away and minded his own business. Then he thought about Soreth standing in that council chamber, telling her story to a room full of people who had never cared about people like her. He thought about the fire in her eyes and the strength in her voice. He thought about what it meant that she was no longer afraid. Yes, he told Maya, he would make the same choice. Every time morning came slowly. The council chamber was even more crowded than before. Word had spread about Soreth's testimony. People wanted to see how this would end. The council members filed in and took their seats. The chairman stood and called for order. The crowd fell silent. The decision was not unanimous. The chairman made that clear from the beginning. There had been heated debate among the council members. Some believed the humans had overstepped their bounds. Others believed they had done nothing wrong under Draconari law. The arguments had gone back and forth for hours. In the end, the vote was 6-5 in favor of allowing the humans to stay. The chamber erupted. Some spectators cheered while others shouted in anger. Varkith rose to his feet and began yelling about corruption and favoritism. Guards moved in to restore order. Through it all, Lucas sat very still and tried to process what had just happened. They had won. Barely, but they had won. The chairman raised his hand for silence. When the noise died down, he announced that the council would be establishing a committee to review the contract labor system. Recent events had raised questions that deserved careful examination. No changes would be made immediately, but the matter would be studied and discussed in the coming months. It was not a revolution. It was not even close to a revolution. But it was something. A crack in a wall that had stood for centuries. A small opening that might grow larger with time. Varkith stormed out of the chamber without speaking to anyone. His eyes followed, their faces dark with anger. Lucas knew this was not the end. Men like Varkith did not accept defeat easily. There would be more challenges ahead, but that was a problem for another day. The weeks that followed were busy. The human squadron returned to their normal duties, patrolling trade routes and responding to emergencies. But things were different now. They were no longer ignored or dismissed. Draconari pilots greeted them over the communication channels. Merchants invited them to special events. Children waved when they walked through the streets. Soreth threw herself into her new role. She proved to be a valuable liaison, helping the humans understand customs they had misinterpreted and avoid mistakes they would have otherwise made. She was still quiet, still careful, but there was a confidence growing in her that had not been there before. She also became something unexpected. A symbol. Other contracted workers began seeking her out. They wanted to hear her story. They wanted to know if what the humans had done could happen again. They wanted to believe that maybe, somewhere out there, someone cared about people like them. Soreth told them the truth. She could not promise them anything. She could not free them the way she had been freed. But she could tell them that change was possible. She could tell them that the council was asking questions no one had asked before. She could tell them that even small cracks could eventually bring down walls. Some of them began to organize. Quietly, carefully, they started talking to each other and sharing their experiences. They began to document abuses and gather evidence. They began to dream about a future that might be different from the past. The council committee met regularly. Progress was slow, frustratingly slow. There were powerful interests who wanted to preserve the old system, and they fought every proposed change. But there were also voices calling for reform, voices that had been silent before. The debate continued month after month, with no clear resolution in sight. 1 year after the council hearing, Saurus stood before a crowd of several hundred Dragonari. They had gathered in a public square to hear her speak about the reform movement. Some were contracted workers themselves. Others were free citizens who had become sympathetic to the cause. A few were council members who had voted to let the humans stay. Lucas stood at the back of the crowd with Maya beside him. He had not been invited to speak. This was not about humans anymore. This was about Draconari deciding what kind of society they wanted to be. Saurus' voice carried across the square. She spoke about dignity and justice, and the right of every person to control their own life. She spoke about the progress they had made, and the challenges that remained. She spoke about the future she believed was possible if they continued to work together. The crowd listened. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked uncertain. A few shook their heads and walked away. Change was never easy and never complete. There would always be those who resisted. When Saurus finished speaking, the crowd applauded. It was not thunderous, not overwhelming, but it was real. These people had come because they believed in something, and they were willing to show their support. Maya asked Lucas if he had ever imagined this when he first noticed those bruises on a waitress's arms. Lucas shook his head. He had not imagined anything beyond helping one person who needed help. Everything else had grown from that single choice, branching out in directions he could never have predicted. That was how change worked, he supposed. You could not plan it or control it. You could only do what seemed right in the moment and hope that it mattered. Sometimes it did. Sometimes a single act of compassion could start something that grew far beyond its origins. Sometimes refusing to look away could make a difference that lasted long after you were gone. The crowd began to disperse. Saurus made her way through the people, shaking hands and answering questions. When she reached Lucas, she stopped and looked at him with those same eyes that had once been filled with fear and hopelessness. She thanked him. Not for the first time, but the words still carried weight. Lucas told her she had nothing to thank him for. She had done the hard work. She had found the courage to stand up and speak. She had become something he could never have made her. That was all her. Saurus smiled. It was a small smile, still touched with the sadness of everything she had endured. But it was real. She walked away to continue her work. Lucas watched her go. Maya asked what he was thinking. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he was thinking about home, about Earth and all the struggles that had shaped it, about the long road from darkness to light that his species had walked over centuries. The Draconari were just starting that journey. They had a long way to go and many battles to fight. But they were moving. Step by step, they were moving. And it had started with one human who refused to look away. That was enough. That would always be enough. 3 weeks passed after Saurus joined the human squadron. In that time, the city of Vareth Prime underwent a subtle transformation. It was nothing dramatic, nothing that would be recorded in history books. But those who paid attention could sense the change. Humans were being treated differently. Not with warmth, exactly. The Draconari were too proud for that. But the cold hostility had softened into something more like curiosity. Merchants who had once refused to serve humans now welcomed them into their shops. Workers who had avoided eye contact now nodded in greeting. Children who had been taught to fear the strange pink creatures now watched them with wonder instead. And everywhere, people were talking about what Lucas Grant had done. The story had taken on a life of its own. In some versions, Lucas was a wealthy prince from Earth who had fallen in love with the beautiful Waitress. In others, he was a secret agent gathering intelligence by placing a spy in their midst. In still others, he was a holy man following the commands of some strange human deity. The truth, that he had simply seen someone suffering and decided to help, seemed too simple to believe. Sarth found herself at the center of attention. Draconari, who had never noticed her before, now sought her out. They wanted to hear her story from her own lips. They wanted to understand what it felt like to be freed by an outsider. They wanted to know if the humans were really as strange as everyone said. She answered their questions as best she could. She described the fear and confusion and disbelief she had felt. She explained that even now, weeks later, she sometimes woke up expecting to find that it had all been a dream. She admitted that she did not fully understand humans either, but that they had been kind to her in ways she had never experienced. Her words had an impact. Some Draconari dismissed her as a fool who had been manipulated by clever aliens. But others listened more carefully. They began to wonder if perhaps the contract system was not as natural and inevitable as they had always assumed. They began to notice the contracted workers in their own lives and wonder about their stories. Maya watched all of this with satisfaction. She told Lucas that he had started something bigger than he realized. He shook his head and said he had not started anything. He had just done what seemed right. Whatever came next was not his doing, but something was coming, and it was not what any of them expected. Varkith had not been idle. He had spent weeks building a coalition of those who shared his anger and his interests. Contract holders, establishment owners, council members with ties to the old families. All of them were troubled by the attention humans were receiving. All of them were worried about what might happen if too many people started questioning traditions that benefited them. They decided to strike at the source. The humans had to go. One morning, Lucas received an official summons. The city council had called a hearing to review the operating permits of the human pilot squadron. Formal complaints had been filed alleging cultural interference, disrespect for local traditions, and conduct unbecoming of diplomatic guests. If the council ruled against them, they would be expelled from Verith Prime within 7 days. Lucas read the summons twice to make sure he understood. Then he called his people together and told them what was happening. Maya was furious. She wanted to fight back, to expose Varkith and his allies for what they really were. Pete was worried about Sarth. If the humans were expelled, what would happen to her? She had no status, no protection, no one to speak for her. Lucas told them both to calm down. Anger would not help them now. They needed to be smart. They needed to prepare. He spent the next several days studying Draconari law and customs. He met with Ambassador Hughes to discuss strategy. He interviewed witnesses who might speak in their favor. He did everything he could think of to prepare for the hearing, but he knew that the odds were against them. Varkith had money and connections. The humans had neither. In a fair contest, truth and justice might prevail. But this was not going to be a fair contest. The day of the hearing arrived. The council chamber was a vast circular room with tiered seating for spectators. It was packed with Draconari who had come to watch the spectacle. Many of them had never seen humans up close before. They craned their necks and whispered to each other as Lucas and his people took their seats. Varkith presented his case first. He was an impressive speaker, his voice deep and resonant, his words carefully chosen. He painted a picture of arrogant outsiders who had no respect for the ways of the Draconari. He described a pattern of interference and insult. He demanded that the council protect their sacred traditions by removing the humans before they could cause more damage. When he finished, the chamber erupted in applause. Many of the spectators clearly agreed with him. The council members sat stone-faced, their expressions impossible to read. Then it was Lucas's turn. He stood slowly and walked to the center of the chamber. He was painfully aware of how small he looked compared to the Draconari around him. He was painfully aware of the hostility in many of the eyes watching him. He did not try to argue against Draconari traditions. He did not claim that humans were superior or that their way of life was better. Instead, he told a story. He told them about Earth, about how humans had once practiced systems similar to the contract arrangements here. He described the slave markets and the indentured servitude, and all the ways that people with power had exploited those without it. He talked about the long struggle to end those systems, the wars that had been fought, the lives that had been lost, the centuries of effort it had taken to build societies where every person had rights that could not be taken away. He told them that he did not judge the Draconari. Every civilization had its own path to walk. Every culture had its own lessons to learn. But he could not pretend he had not seen what he had seen. He could not ignore suffering when it was right in front of him. That was not the kind of person he was. That was not the kind of people humans were. The chamber was silent when he finished. No applause, but no jeers either. Just silence. Then a voice spoke from the spectator section. It was so RETH. She had not been scheduled to speak. She had not been listed as a witness. But she stood up and demanded to be heard. The council members looked at each other uncertainly. Finally, the chairman nodded and gestured for her to approach. Soreth walked down to the center of the chamber. Her scales were pale and her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. She told them about her life. The uncle who had sold her. The years of work with no end in sight. The punishments that came without reason and without mercy. The bruises she had learned to hide and the tears she had learned to swallow. She told them about the hopelessness that had filled her days and the certainty that no one would ever care what happened to her dad, and then she told them about the day a human looked at her and saw a person. She described how Lucas had noticed things that no one else had bothered to see, how he had asked questions when everyone else had turned away, how he had spent everything he had to give her something that it should have been hers from the beginning. She asked the council a simple question. If doing that was a crime, then what did it say about them? The silence that followed was different from before. This was not the silence of indifference or hostility. This was the silence of people who were genuinely thinking about what they had heard. The chairman called for a recess. The council would deliberate and announce their decision the following morning. Lucas walked out of the chamber, not knowing what would happen next. He had done everything he could. The rest was out of his hands. The news spread through Vareth Prime like fire through dry grass. A human pilot commander had paid an outrageous sum to purchase the contract of a Draconari waitress. Within hours, everyone was talking about it. In the markets and the docking bays and the council chambers, the same questions were being asked. Why would a human do such a thing? What could he possibly want from her? What was his game? Lucas ignored the whispers. He had one more thing to do before the matter was settled. He went to the Ember Hearth at closing time. The staff was cleaning up and putting away supplies. They stopped and stared when he walked in. They had heard the news. They did not know what to make of it. Sarth was in the back wiping down tables. She froze when she saw him. Her eyes went wide, and her hands began to tremble. She had heard the news too. She knew that her contract had been purchased. She knew that she now belonged to this human, and she had no idea what that meant for her. Lucas approached her slowly. He kept his hands visible and his voice soft. He told her that he needed to speak with her privately. He asked if there was somewhere they could talk. Soreth led him to a small storage room. She stood with her back against the wall, as if preparing for a blow. Her whole body was tense with fear. Lucas reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder of documents. He set them on a crate between them. He told her to look at them. Sorth opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were papers covered in legal text, stamped with official seals. She read through them slowly, her eyes moving back and forth across the lines. As she read, her trembling grew worse. Her breathing became uneven. Her scale seemed to pale even further. Lucas asked if she understood what she was reading. Sorth looked up at him. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. These papers said that her contract was terminated. These papers said that she was a free citizen of Vareth Prime, with all the rights and protections that status carried. These papers said that she belonged to no one. She asked why. Lucas considered how to answer. He could give her a long explanation about human values and beliefs. He could talk about the history of his species and the struggles they had fought to end systems like the one she had been trapped in. He could explain his own personal journey and the choices that had led him to this moment. But she did not need speeches. She needed the truth, spoken simply. He told her that where he came from, people were not property. He told her that when he saw someone suffering, he tried to help. He told her that she did not owe him anything, and that she was free to go wherever she wanted and do whatever she chose. Sorth stared at him. She did not seem to believe what she was hearing. She asked what he wanted in return. There had to be something. No one gave something for nothing. That was not how the world worked. Lucas shook his head. He wanted nothing. The papers were hers. The freedom was hers. She could walk out of this room and never see him again if that was what she wanted. For a long moment, Sorth did not move. Then something broke inside her. Her composure crumbled. She sank to the floor and pressed her hands against her face and wept. Great shuddering sobs shook her body. Years of fear and pain and hopelessness poured out of her in that small storage room. Lucas did not know what to do. He was not good with emotional moments. He had spent too many years keeping his own feelings locked away, but he could not leave her there alone. So he sat down on a crate nearby and waited. He did not try to touch her or comfort her with words. He simply stayed, a quiet presence while she released everything she had been holding inside. Eventually, the tears slowed. Sorth lifted her head and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. She asked what she was supposed to do now. She had no home. She had no family. She had no skills except serving food to strangers. How was she supposed to survive as a free person when she had no idea how to be free? Lucas admitted that he had not thought that far ahead. He had been focused on getting her out of the contract. He had not considered what came after. But he told her that they would figure it out together. The next few days were chaotic. Word of what Lucas had done continued to spread, and the reactions were mixed. Some Draconari were disgusted. They saw his actions as an insult to their traditions, an outsider meddling in affairs he did not understand. Others were curious. They wanted to know more about these strange creatures who spent fortunes to free strangers. The human squadron became a subject of intense interest. Draconari, who had never spoken to them before, now approached with questions. They wanted to understand the reasoning behind what Lucas had done. They struggled to process the idea of helping someone without expecting anything in return. Maya fielded most of these conversations. She explained human values as best she could. She talked about concepts like compassion and justice, and the belief that all people had inherent worth regardless of their status. Many Draconari found these ideas strange, even incomprehensible. But some of them listened. Some of them seemed to be genuinely thinking about what they were hearing. Pete took care of Sorth. He found her temporary quarters in the human barracks and made sure she had food and clothing and everything else she needed. He was gentle with her, treating her like a frightened animal that needed time to learn that not everyone was going to hurt her. Lucas dealt with the political fallout. Ambassador Hughes was not happy. She had warned him to be quiet and careful, and instead he had become the talk of the entire city. But she could not argue with the results. Humans were suddenly being viewed differently. Not with respect, perhaps, but with something other than dismissal. Then Maya came to Lucas with an idea. They needed a local liaison, someone who understood Draconari culture and could help them navigate situations they did not fully comprehend. Soreth had spent her entire life in Varith Prime. She knew how things worked here. She could be valuable to them, and in return, they could give her a purpose and a place to belong. Lucas brought the idea to Soreth. He made it clear that this was an offer, not an order. She was free to refuse. She was free to leave and build her own life somewhere else if that was what she wanted. Soreth thought about it for a long time. Finally, she said yes. She did not know what the future held. She did not fully trust that this was real, that these humans were truly as kind as they seemed. But she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. She would take the chance. She moved into permanent quarters at the human barracks. She began learning about Earth and its people and the strange customs that had produced beings capable of what Lucas had done. Slowly, carefully, she started to believe that maybe the world was not as cruel as she had always thought, but far away, in a luxurious estate on the other side of the city, Varkith was not ready to let go. He had been humiliated by a human. He had been forced to sell something that belonged to him. He had lost face in front of his peers and his subordinates. And he was determined to make Lucas Grant pay for every moment of shame that he summoned his allies. Other establishment owners, other contract holders, others who profited from the system that humans now threatened. Together, they began to plan their revenge. Maya spent 3 days gathering information. She spoke to merchants and traders and anyone willing to talk to a human. She visited the public records office and paid the fee to access legal documents. She sat in corners of busy establishments and listened to conversations she was not meant to hear. When she finally reported back to Lucas, her face was grim and her voice was tight with anger. Draconari society was built on layers. At the top were the old families, those who could trace their lineage back thousands of years to the first empire builders. Below them were the merchants and military officers, respected but never equal to those born with ancient names. Further down were the common workers, the crafters and farmers and pilots who kept everything running. And at the very bottom were those who had nothing. No family, no wealth, no protection. These lowest ones could enter into service contracts. The system was presented as a form of employment, a way for those without resources to earn their place in society. In exchange for food and shelter and a small allowance, they agreed to work for a contract holder for a set number of years. It sounded reasonable on the surface. Many civilizations had similar arrangements, but the reality was different. Contract holders had almost total control over their workers. They could assign any task at any time. They could punish failures with reduced pay, extended work hours, or physical discipline. The law allowed them to strike their contracted workers as long as no permanent damage was caused. And the contracts themselves could be extended for violations, which meant that a worker who displeased their holder might never earn their freedom. Females in service positions had it even worse. They were considered less valuable than males in traditional Draconari culture. Many were pushed into contracts by families who saw them as burdens rather than blessings. Once contracted, they had almost no legal recourse. Complaints against contract holders were rarely investigated. Those who tried to run away were tracked down and punished severely. Lucas listened to all of this without interrupting. When Maya finished, he asked about Soreth specifically. Maya handed him a data tablet with everything she had found. Soreth was 23 years old in Earth terms. Her parents had died when she was young, leaving her in the care of an uncle who had little interest in raising another mouth. When she reached working age, her uncle had sold her contract to pay off gambling debts. She had been working at the Ember Hearth for 5 years. Her original contract had been for 7 years, but it had been extended 3 times for supposed violations. At the current rate, she would never be free. The owner of her contract was a wealthy Draconari named Varkith. He owned several establishments across the city, including the Ember Hearth. He was known for being harsh with his workers, but he was also politically connected. His family had ties to several council members. Local authorities looked the other way when complaints were filed against him. Pete had learned more from his conversations with the kitchen staff. They said that Varkith visited the Ember Hearth regularly to collect payments and inspect his workers. He was especially cruel to Sorith because she was small and quiet and never fought back. The bruises Lucas had seen were not unusual. They appeared regularly, healed slowly, and were replaced by new ones. Lucas closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had faced many difficult situations in his life. He had flown missions that seemed impossible. He had lost friends and made hard choices and lived with the consequences. But this was different. This was not a battle he could win with weapons or tactics. This was something far more complicated. Maya asked what he wanted to do. Lucas said he did not know yet. He needed to think. He needed to understand the options before he made any decisions. He spent the next day studying Draconari law. It was dense and complicated, full of traditions and precedents that went back centuries. But buried within all that complexity, he found something useful. Contracts could be transferred. If someone was willing to pay the full value of a contract plus compensation to the current holder, they could take ownership of that contract. It was expensive, but it was legal, and once someone owned a contract, they could do anything they wanted with it, including ending it and setting the worker free. Lucas began calculating. The purchase price for a contract like Sorith's would be substantial. The compensation to Varkith for losing a worker would add even more. Altogether, it would be more money than Lucas had saved in 20 years of military service. It was more than his entire squadron could pool together, but it was possible. Difficult, but possible. He called a meeting with Maya and Pete. He explained what he was thinking. He told them the cost and the risks. If they did this, they would be interfering in local affairs. The peacekeeping agreement was clear about avoiding cultural conflicts. If things went wrong, they could all be expelled from Varith Prime. Their careers could be ended. Everything they had worked for could be lost. Maya did not hesitate. She said she would contribute every credit she had. Pete said the same. They did not care about the risks. They had seen what was happening to Sorith, and they could not pretend they had not seen it. Lucas felt something warm in his chest. Pride, perhaps, or gratitude. He had served with many soldiers. Over the years, but few had earned his trust the way these two had. He told them to gather the money quietly. He would handle the next step himself. The next morning, Lucas requested a meeting with Ambassador Carol Hughes. She was the senior human diplomatic representative in the city, responsible for managing relations between Earth and the Draconari authorities. She was in her 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes and a reputation for being both cautious and effective. Lucas explained the situation. He told her about Sorith and the contract system and what he wanted to do. He asked for help with the legal procedures. Ambassador Hughes listened carefully. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told him that he was putting her in a very difficult position. The diplomatic situation was fragile. Humans were still building trust with the Draconari. Any incident could set them back years. Lucas said he understood. He was not asking for her approval. He was asking for her help in doing something legal under Draconari law. He would take full responsibility for whatever happened next. Hughes studied him for a long time. Finally, she nodded slowly. She said she would help him with the paperwork. but he had to handle everything else himself. He had to be careful and quiet and give no one any reason to claim the humans were interfering in local culture. Lucas agreed. He thanked her and left her office. He had the money. He had the legal support. Now he just needed to face Varkith himself. The meeting was arranged for the following evening. Lucas went alone. He entered a private room in one of Varkith's establishments and found himself facing a massive Draconari with scales the color of dried blood. Varkith looked at him with open amusement. A human wanting to do business. How entertaining. Lucas made his offer. He wanted to purchase Sorth's contract. He named the price he was willing to pay. Varkith laughed. He said the price was far too low. He named a number that was nearly double what Lucas had expected. It was clearly meant to be insulting. He expected the human to back down and leave in shame. Lucas did not back down. He agreed to the price without hesitation. The laughter died in Varkith's throat. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Confusion, perhaps. Or the first hint of anger at being outmaneuvered by a creature he considered beneath him. The deal was done. The papers were signed. Sorth's contract now belonged to Lucas Grant. The city of Vareth Prime never slept. Ships came and went at all hours, carrying goods and passengers from 100 different worlds. The streets were always crowded with traders and workers and travelers looking for their next destination. It was a place where many species crossed paths, but few ever stayed long enough to call it home. The humans were different. They had arrived 6 months ago as part of a peacekeeping agreement between Earth and the Galactic Council. A small squadron of pilots, just 12 in total, assigned to patrol the trade routes and assist with emergency rescues. It was not a glamorous posting. Most species viewed it as proof that humans were still new to the galactic stage. Given simple tasks while the more important work went to older and more established civilizations. Commander Lucas Grant did not mind. He was 38 years old, with gray starting to show at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of long years in service. He had requested this assignment himself. After 2 decades of flying combat missions and watching too many young pilots die in wars that never seemed to end, he wanted something quieter. Something that might actually help people instead of destroying them. His squadron had settled into a routine. Morning briefings to patrol shifts, equipment maintenance, and evenings spent exploring the city. Vareth Prime was dominated by the Draconari, a species that humans found both fascinating and intimidating. They stood over 2 meters tall, with scaled skin in shades of green and bronze, elongated faces filled with sharp teeth, and vestigial wing membranes that stretched from their arms to their torsos. They were proud and ancient, and they made it very clear that humans were tolerated guests. Nothing more. Lucas accepted this without complaint. He told his people to be respectful, to learn local customs, and to avoid causing trouble. They were here to prove that humanity could be trusted, and that meant swallowing their pride and doing the job well. Their favorite place to eat was a small establishment called the Ember Hearth. It was not fancy. The furniture was worn, and the walls were stained with decades of cooking smoke. But the food was good and the prices were fair, and it was close to their barracks. Most importantly, the owner did not refuse to serve humans, which was more than could be said for many places in the city. Lieutenant Maya Collins had found the place during their first week. She was 29, sharp-tongued and quick-tempered. With dark hair she kept cut short for convenience. She had grown up in the military, following in her father's footsteps, and she had little patience for anything she considered a waste of time. But she was loyal to her people, and she was good at her job, which was all Lucas asked of anyone. Sergeant Pete Howard was the one who kept them coming back. He was 34, broad-shouldered, and soft-spoken, with a talent for fixing anything mechanical and a genuine love of cooking. He had befriended the kitchen staff by trading recipes and asking questions about local ingredients. The Draconari cooks found him amusing. This small pink creature so interested in their food, and they occasionally let him watch them work. Their usual waitress was a young Draconari female named Soreth. She was smaller than most of her kind, barely taller than Lucas, with scales and a pale shade of green that suggested she spent most of her life indoors. She served them with quiet efficiency, never speaking more than necessary, her movements careful and precise. Lucas noticed that she was different from the other Draconari they encountered. When locals looked at humans, their expressions ranged from open hostility to cold indifference. But Soreth would sometimes offer small kindnesses. She would warn them about dishes that were too spicy for human stomachs. She would bring extra water without being asked. Once, when Maya had been struggling with a translation device, Soreth had quietly adjusted the settings before walking away. These were tiny things, easily overlooked. But Lucas had spent his life reading people, watching for the small details that revealed what someone was really thinking. He noticed everything about Soreth. How she kept her eyes down when speaking to customers. How she flinched slightly whenever a loud noise came from the kitchen. How she moved with the careful awareness of someone who was always expecting something bad to happen. And then one evening, he noticed the bruises. They were faint, barely visible against her pale scales, but they were there. Discolorations along her neck ridges and forearms that she tried to hide beneath the long sleeves of her uniform. Lucas had seen marks like that before on soldiers who had been through rough interrogations, on civilians who had been caught in violence. He knew what they meant. He said nothing at first. He was not sure what he could say. This was not his world, and these were not his people. The rules here were different, and he had no authority to interfere in matters that did not concern him. But he found himself watching Soreth more carefully after that. He noticed how she sometimes moved stiffly, as if her body hurt. He noticed how her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. He noticed how the other staff treated her with casual cruelty, giving her the worst tables and the longest shifts. Maya noticed him noticing. She sat down across from him one evening after Soreth had taken their orders and walked away. She asked what was wrong. Lucas told her what he had seen. Maya's expression darkened. She had grown up with a father who believed that protecting the weak was the first duty of anyone with strength. She did not like what she was hearing. Lucas asked her to do something for him. He wanted her to quietly gather information about how Draconari society treated its workers. He wanted to know what rights they had, what protections existed, what happened to people who had no power and no voice. Maya agreed without hesitation. Pete overheard their conversation. He said nothing, but later that night he went back to the ember hearth alone. He brought a bottle of earth whiskey and shared it with the kitchen staff. They drank together and talked about food and families and the things that made life worth living. And somewhere in that conversation, Pete learned some things about Soreth that made his heart ache. He reported back to Lucas the next morning. What he had learned was worse than any of them had imagined. Soreth was not just a mistreated worker. She was trapped in a system that gave her no way out. She belonged to someone in every way that mattered, and the law protected her owner, not her. Lucas stood at the window of his quarters and looked out at the city. Ships were launching and landing in the distance, carrying people to better lives and brighter futures. Somewhere in that city, a young woman was serving food to strangers and hiding her bruises and hoping that maybe tomorrow would hurt a little less than today. He had come to Vareth Prime looking for peace. He had wanted to stop fighting, to stop making hard choices that cost people their lives. He had wanted to be somewhere quiet where he could finish his career without any more blood on his hands. But some things could not be ignored. Some things demanded action, no matter the cost. Lucas made a decision. He did not know yet what he would do or how he would do it. But he knew that he could not look away. He could not pretend he had not seen what he had seen. He could not eat at that restaurant and smile at that woman and know that she was suffering while he did nothing. He was a human, and humans did not abandon people who needed help.